Afternoon YouTube. What's happening? Saw a bloke, he asked a question the other day about, I think it was, he had a 120 to 240 volt compatible inverter, and he's trying to figure out how many solar panels he can put on it. So it's sort of, I suppose if you're an enthusiast, you don't really think, well, if you're an enthusiast, you sort of have a tendency to go out and figure these things out. But when you're starting out new, you don't really know what's safe and what isn't safe. So, I just thought I'll just do a really quick one at appropriately sizing something, because there is a couple of gotchas in it that might not be obvious to a beginner, like right off the bat. And so the first thing you need is the specs of your inverter. Now, he said it's a 120 to 240 volt inverter. I think I'll see if I can find the comment and I'll put it up. But you know your limit, then you've got to figure out what configuration you can have your solar panels in. So what's important here is that we've got the voltage open circuit. Now this is the voltage of the panel in sunlight when there's nothing being drawn off the panel. The VMP, this is where your maximum power point is. Like, you're going to get the highest current out of this thing when it's at 30.9 volts. So this one is the one used to calculate the limit. So what we do in a situation where, hey, it can go 120 to 240, well, we want to be as close to 240 as possible. The higher the voltage, the less current that you have to pull the same amount of power, although you're always going to get to 8.42. If you parallel a bunch together, every time you parallel a string, you're going to double that amperage, right? We're going to add that amperage on again. If you go up in series, the amperage stays the same, but the voltage goes higher, and that's good for a number of reasons, like voltage drop and whatnot. It also might put it might pay to read your inverter and see where your inverter operates at the most efficient. So, as an example, they'll take 1,000 volts in, but they only operate up to 800 volts. So, you want to sort of target the optimal efficiency range for your hardware. So, how would we determine what is a good string? We take this number, and if there's 2 panels in the string, it's going to be 38.1 times 2, right? So let's just call it 40 volts. So we've got 80 volts. The guy's got up to 240 volt input, so we can keep on going up. I think he said he had 8 panels. So if we went to 4 panels, we'd have 160 volts. Now, if we were to put all 8 of them in a string, we would exceed the inverter's input power. So we wouldn't do that. We're probably going to put 2 strings on at 160 volts and put them through a combiner box. Now, as you've seen in previous videos, that is not without consequence as well. But for the purpose of this, that's effective. So what you'd end up with is basically 160 volts open circuit, and what does that work out to? 16. So just not sort of 17-ish amps, right? That tells you your cable size. Like, can you get that down 4mm square cable? Do you need 6mm square cable? You end up with your resulting required amperage. Now, this is where the gotchas are. Some people will say you got to leave 10% headroom in your voltage, right? So if we say, hey, we're going to get as close to 240, let's say we had 6 panels in a row, and that takes us to 240 volts exactly. That's a terrible idea, because panels are rated at, I think it's 25 degrees Celsius, and you can actually see here, this is the rating it had, and this is the way they tested it, right? And it's at 25 degrees Celsius. But when the temperature goes down, the efficiency of the panel goes up, and so the voltage will go up with it. And lots of people say, I'll just give it 10, ooh, what's that? That's that inverter BMS. High cell voltage. That's that cell 13. Sorry about the distraction, guys. I'll get back to the video shortly. Which one is it? So I've suspected for a while that it's 13. It's cell 8 this time. Cell 8 has gone above its, but the BMS is block charge, so that's not the end of the world. You know what we're going to do? I don't want any more distractions today. Let's just switch that off. Yeah, let's get back to the video. Glad that's working. Where was I? Yeah. So when it's cold outside, you're in an area that you might get snow, right, and suddenly the sun comes out, you will see an incredible amount of power come out of your panels. In fact, it'll exceed this testing criteria that they used. So also, I'm certain I can go back through my, we log absolutely everything, right? The voltage on the panels, the current coming out of the panels, the wattage, like all the time. Like it's, I know it's a mess up there, but there's a lot of compute up there doing stuff with our solar gear so that we can understand, you know, like what might be letting us down. I've seen it go as high as 24% over. Right, only for bursts, not for sustained periods, but for bursts. So that's in yield. Now, whether or not that yield results in, now it's a couple of days later, finally got around to making those slides. Sort of forgotten where I was at, but I'll try and fucking realign with it. So when the real danger in this is if you don't know how to correctly size your solar panels, then you're probably highly at risk of potentially making another mistake, right? So what I'd urge you to do really is find one of your mates who knows what they're doing, or find a licensed person who can do it and help you to understand what the risks are, right? But just so in a nutshell, just for the sake of it, in a nutshell, there's a couple of just hard and fast rules that you should probably stick to, right? And the first one is that when you're sizing these things, voltage is a non-negotiable limit, right? So those things over there, 800 volts operating voltage, but 1,000 volts like on the string when the string's doing nothing, right? So sitting idle. These, very clear, 250 volt limit, 150 volt limit, 150 volt limit, 150 volt limit, right? Very straightforward. That's not to be, like people will go, oh yeah, but it's voltage and current. No, don't worry about the current just yet. Current affects your wires more than anything. Yield is flexible. So these things could be slightly over-provisioned. As long as they stay under their short circuit current, the yield on the panels could be potentially higher than what this thing can throughput, and that's okay. You can oversize them a little bit. Those, under Australian regulations, they can be like 30% oversized, which is where you see that magic number of like, hey, I've got a 5 kilowatt inverter, but I've got 6.6 kilowatts worth of panels, right? They let you do that. You know, like they're fairly robust. They've got switching mechanisms in them that are, you know, probably oversized for the job that they're doing to add safety. So let's not. What we don't want to do is we don't want to conflate the voltage with the current or the yield. All right, the yield is flexible. The current's even flexible, but the current impacts your wire size more than anything. Here we go. All right, so the most important thing is when you're going to size any system is that the voltage has to be of the panel must be greater than whatever you're pushing to when it comes to DC stuff, right? So even though this thing can take up to 250 volts in, the output comes down to like 58 volts in my scenario. But if this was a 12 volt panel, the PV input has to be greater than the battery voltage by at least 5 volts, I believe, is what they specify in the sheet. I'm pretty sure that they work better than that, but they specify in the sheet that PV voltage should be 5 volts above the battery voltage, and then the MPPT process will kick in for the first time. Now, if it fluctuates up and down from there, it doesn't really matter. It's just that early morning kickoff. It waits to a threshold and then it goes. To be honest, I've seen it kick in earlier than that. So I don't even know where that number come from. I've seen it in the documentation. With those, they've got a startup voltage, which is, I think for mine, it's 80 volts. Or it's 80 on the Primos, and the Galvos are like 110 or 120, I think. So using this scenario, in order for power to flow to the battery, the solar panel must be higher than the voltage of the batteries. And I'm going to try and cover both because I'm not sure. The guy said he had an inverter, but I think it's important just to understand the fundamentals. All right. So if the panel was 12 volts and we needed to charge a battery that's charge voltage was 14.7, there is no power step up. It's just not going to flow. All right. And almost the same thing is true of the inverters, but different situation. We'll explain that in a minute. So for example, if we've started with a panel that's 18 to 24 volt, which is a fairly typical automotive panel. You'll find them on people's four-wheel drives. Most MPPTs or PWM controllers can deal with that. I mean, you should all be using Victron in my opinion, but so if we had a 24 volt panel, a 24 volt battery or a 29.4 volt nominal fully charged battery, will the 18 to 24 charge it? No, it won't, because the voltage is lower and the power will not flow to the other side. So when it comes to the inverters, they have a similar limit, which is their startup voltage. They will bump power up, but in order for them to effectively do that, they have to achieve a minimum PV voltage before the internal buck or boost converter will boost it up to meet the AC line. So in my case, using the Primos, we're at 80 volts, which means 18 to 24 volt panel isn't going to work. It's just not going to be able to start the inverter up. So that's our base panel, 18 to 24 volts. If we want to achieve a higher voltage and our panels are only 18 to 24 volts, we need to use more than one panel. In this scenario, we're connecting the negative of one to the positive of the other, or in my case, the positive of one to the negative to the other, and that increases the voltage. It doesn't increase the current. We're only worried about voltage at this point because the first limit that we've got to consider is what is the maximum voltage input of our devices. 250 and 150. 1,000, like who cares about those? Given that the guy's question was about I think it was a 120 to 240 volt, that's sort of what I'm trying to hit at here. So in this scenario, we're going back to our DC one. We've got a 29.4 volt fully charged battery, but we're now charging with 36 to 48 volts, depending if you have the 18 or 24 volt panels. But we still haven't hit 80 volt start up here because we've only got 36 to 48. So what do? We just keep stringing them. We keep stringing them in line until we either run out of panels or we meet the voltage that will actually start the inverter up, right? And then we can exceed that start voltage, but we will never ever exceed the limit. So we've gone and put 5 of these panels in. We've got between 90 and 120 volts. Is that now sufficient? Yes, it is. Right, the voltage on the right is higher than the voltage on the left, the startup voltage, therefore power will flow. So, what if we just kept on going? Like what happens if we just keep going up right up to the limit? This is the thing, you never exceed that limit, and there is a scenario that we'll talk about where we might exceed that limit. Putting 34 panels on there, you're probably going to exceed the yield of the inverter anyway, but 34 is where that's the hard limit. You've gone past 800 volts. Any higher than that, you're at risk of potentially going past the short circuit voltage of the 5 kilowatt inverter. So, the second limit is being hit, which is the current times voltage, right? So at this point, we've got 24 times 8 equals 192 or times 34, so 6,528. We haven't actually hit the limit. If we oversize that 30%, that would actually be just below the limit. So we do not over-provision on voltage, but we can over-provision on yield. It's a 5 kilowatt inverter and our panels have come out at 6,528 watts. That is perfect. That is exactly where we want it. We know that the Fronius inverter will go up to 1,000 volts, but its operating voltage is at 800. That is, you've just hit the 800 volt limit. To be honest, I would come one panel down from that, because in the cold, these panels are all tested at a voltage and a yield based on 25 degrees Celsius. So if you had a cold, sunshiny day, you'd probably be at risk of being over the limit. That would be that entire inverter absolutely at its maximum capacity. So with a 5 kilowatt inverter, we take the inverter size at 5,000 watts and we times it by 1.32, which gives us 6,600 watts. So that is 100% on the limit. All right, so what happens if we're going to use, the other scenario is, what happens if we hit our voltage limit and we're nowhere near our yield limit? Well, that's actually really straightforward. So we're going to use, in this, we're going to use Kanika thin films. I thought I had a slide for Kanika thin films. Didn't I? Yeah, we did. There it is. So a Kanika thin film is a high performance low light panel, but it doesn't yield much, right? They're quite big and heavy, and yeah, they generally don't yield a lot. They're 110 watts, but they're a very high voltage. So in this situation, we would say we've got 13 60 volt panels, gets us to 780 watts. We don't want to go over that, because then we're at risk of going past the short circuit limit of the inverter on a cold day. But now our yield is only 13 times 110 watts, so 1430 watts. That is shit. All right, so that's what our string. We'll move forward, assuming that we've got an inverter that can take in 300 volts. We've maxed out our string. It's at 60 volts times 5. You get 300 volts. So that is only going to yield us 550 watts, which is horrendous. Let's say we're still using a 5 kilowatt inverter, so what do? Well, now we can start paralleling together, right? So that we join the negatives of the two strings. So we've got five strings in a row to make our 300 volts. We make another string of five panels in a row. We join the negatives together, we join the positives together, and then we double the amperage, right? Which also increases our yield. So our yield goes up to 1100 watts. So in order to fill this inverter up, we're going to have to do that like 6 times, and that will get us to exactly 6.6 kilowatts. So you'd end up with 6 strings of 5. This is the bit where you've got to watch out for, though, is now the current is starting to go up. So if we did this with bigger panels, we might start seeing 8 amps, 11 amps per string. And then if you strung 5 or 6 of them together, suddenly you got 50, you got close to 50 amps, and that requires really big cabling. And in the cabling, the amps are the limit, not the voltage. So on the device, voltage is the limit, it's a non-negotiable limit. On the cable, you'll soon have a fire if you have too much amps and not a big enough cable. You can probably see that the time of day's changed. I had to leave it where I was at because I had to shoot off for a meeting. But that, like in a nutshell, I'm hoping helps that guy to understand at a high level how you should provision your solar. There's way more to it than that. Like there's so much information that you need to consider. Like that cable there is good for the amps that that this string is good for. If you were to string 3 of these together, suddenly you need some decent sized cable, right? We use 6mm square for the solar patios. Cable above that size, 6mm square is already fairly expensive. So if you're talking about like low voltage strings, and his string was a low voltage string, it was at sort of 240 volts. That's fairly low voltage. Like the cost of install gets significantly better with those because you can use really thin cable because you're only talking about one set of panels at 8 amps or whatever the case may be. So don't take any of this as an instructional guide because it definitely isn't. I was just trying to help that guy answer his question. There's so much other stuff that you need to consider, like you've got to put breakers in, you're going to put combiner boxes in, they're going to add up more current for you. The MPPTs, like the maximum power point in the panel is literally a suggested number because you've got no control over the way that these things pull power from it. I've seen mine go over current quite a few times. In fact, I had to oversize one of my breakers because of it. So it's yet another gotcha. I'd really urge that bloke to definitely engage a friend, engage somebody who knows what they're doing. DIY solar is fun right up until you burn your house down, right up until one of your friends or your animals gets hurt, or worse still, one of your kids. So I would seriously look to get some advice from a close friend or somebody who can supervise you while you're doing it if you don't fully understand all the risks. There would be nothing worse than somebody taking your advice and then going away not understanding it and then burning your house down. Like it'd be awful. So look, I'm going to leave it at that. Don't take this as a tutorial. It definitely isn't. It's just a general. It's how I would assess somebody's solar. I'm sure that the solar guys, the electricians in the comments, are going to probably roast me for my ideas and whatnot. And if I've got it wrong, sure, you go right ahead and do that. But yeah, look, that's a fairly big system you're talking about. Like on the DIY scale, ask for some help. Don't be shy. Most people won't shoot you. If there's people out there that shoot people for asking for advice or wanting to get into this as a hobby, man, those people are assholes. Find better friends, in my opinion. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.